Hi there, and welcome to this lecture. In this video, we will explore a better way of handling exceptions in Perl using two modules, try-tiny SmartCatch and Exception class, instead of using eval and die functions as we saw before. First of all, why would we want to use modules to handle exceptions instead of using the good old baked-in error handling in Perl? Well, some very valid reasons would be that maybe you would like to execute some additional logic in your code when a known exception was thrown, or you might want to log exceptions with different priority based on exception type. For example, if a user enters invalid password when logging into your app, you might want to throw invalid password exception. And of course, there's plenty other scenarios. Using die and eval and maybe some rejects could achieve this organization of error layers. But trust me, that would be a huge mess real quick. And by the end of the day, we don't have to do it because we have some very awesome tools at our disposal. As I mentioned before, the first module is called try-tiny SmartCatch, and it basically allows you to catch errors in different blocks by package name, rejects, exact errors, and handle unknown exceptions. The second module is Exception class. This module allows you to create custom named exception objects with attributes and other goodies that massively allows you to enhance the management of errors. Let's start by installing these modules. Now the first thing you want to do, you want to go to Meta cpan, and what you want to search for is tiny SmartCatch. So if you open it up, you're going to be presented with quite detailed documentation, and I highly suggest you to read through it to understand bits and pieces that maybe we will not touch on in this lecture. And that stands for every module. If you don't understand something or you would like to try additional functionality, it is highly encouraged to check the documentation. For the time being, let's copy this name, try-tiny SmartCatch, and let's go to our terminal. Now, I'm going to use my editor's terminal to install this module. So cpan and the module name. And it was pretty quick to install. Now the next module that I mentioned was exception class, and it's written as exception : class. So here it is in first suggestions. Again, as before, you can check the documentation if you want to find out more, but for time being, let's just copy the module name. Let's go back to our terminal and let's install it as well. This is going to take a second or two to get installed, and I'll see you once it's done. Now the modules are done installing, and we are ready to use them in our code. However, before we proceed, I would like to have a quick refresher on how we throw and handle errors in Perl. So if you remember, we use this keyword called die, then followed by a message. For example, I can type "this is it." If we run this, and maybe let's add a print statement. If we say something like "hello," save our code, go to the console, run the script, and we're going to see this is it without hello being printed out. Now if we use the eval keyword and wrap around our die statement, save this, we're going to see hello printed out because the die was handled. And to print out error, we can use this special variable with $@ symbol. If we save this, we run our code, we're going to see that we print hello, and in this variable we have the exception that was thrown, and also it indicates on which line it was thrown in our script. Now this is the old way. Let's see how we can handle errors in a new way. So first of all, we need to use both of our modules, so let's do that. So the first module is called try-tiny SmartCatch, so use try : tiny : and SmartCatch. And the second module is called use exception class. Now let's start by handling exceptions with try-tiny SmartCatch. What you can do, you can type this keyword try, followed by sub, and you can put your code in here, in between this try sub block. Now to catch general errors, we can use this catch default, followed by sub, and all the errors that are going to be thrown, which we do not handle in a specific way, are going to end up here. Now for example, if I say error that we receive is in this local context denoted by $_, and here we can throw, for example, die, this is it. If we save this, run our code, oops, and looks like we forgot one of the colons, so exception : class, we rerun this, and what we're going to see is this is it, which is exception that occurred on line 14. Now, this doesn't seem really useful at this point. I mean, we are throwing errors, we're just catching them by default. So what's the big deal with this? Now, the real power comes with using these in conjunction with exception class. Now, how you construct custom exceptions with exception class is by you provide a list context and you define your new exception. For example, my exception. And we can see this here in the construct. Let's give an example. So all we need to do is we also need to wrap it as a string. Your exception name has to be a string. Now the question is, how do we use them? Well, you use custom exceptions by writing my exception, or however you named your exception, and calling a method, which is going to be inherited from the exception class called throw. And here, if you look at the documentation, you can throw exceptions with specific messages. So what we could say is, for example, error, something is not right. Now if we do this, save the code, rerun our script, we're going to see something is not right printed to the console. Okay, you might be wondering, right, we're throwing custom exceptions now, but there's not much difference, so I still don't see the point of them. Well, we have to go back to the try-tiny SmartCatch and explore the documentation there. If you look at the documentation, you're going to see that you can actually catch specific exceptions. So, for example, here we can write something like catch when, exception name, and the subroutine. Let's do that. After our try block, and before the catch default, which is the handler or unknown exceptions, we can write something like catch when, then the exception name. In this case, this is my exception, followed by its arrow notation, which takes subroutine. And here we can do something like say, I know this exception, exclamation mark. Now if we save the code, rerun it, and here we can see that we actually printed out I know this exception, instead of just falling into the catch default block. Now imagine in your code you have different scenarios, such as you could not connect to a database, or you could not parse a JSON, or your file system is full, or so on and so on. Maybe these are exceptions you want to recover from. In that case, you can add as many catch when blocks as you want, for example, my exception, and let's replace it with something like app, file system, full. Let's copy this exception, add it here, and let's quote it. And now instead of saying my exception throw, we can do app, file system, full, and throw. And we can say something like, oh no, the disk space is full, exclamation mark. Let's introduce two scenarios. For example, if you use a conditional statement like if, now I'm going to say this random, which we looked at before, 5, is larger than 2, then we want to throw this exception. Else, we want to throw my exception, throw an error, something else. And instead of here, we could actually print out exceptions themselves. So I'm going to replace these. Maybe I'm actually going to put them in a string context, so we have a better visibility instead of the full stack trace. So let's wrap this context with string as well. And if we go to our terminal, run the code, we're going to see something else. Let's run it again. Still something else. Oh, and our exception changed, because there's a chance that if this random number is larger than 2, we're going to throw this specific exception. Otherwise, we're going to throw the my exception. So here, the first 2 times, we threw the something else. And the third time, we actually threw the disk space exception that says the disk space is full. Hopefully you do agree that handling exceptions this way is much better approach and gives you much more flexibility than just simply putting die statements in your code and trying to reject specific exceptions. We're not going to go into too much detail on this. However, just know that in our exception class, we're not just restricted to saying error something. We can also add our own attributes that we can get on the current context of a known exception to do some additional logic. For now, what I'm demonstrating here is that when you throw specific custom exceptions, you can handle them in different ways in a very trivial approach that is just so much better than throwing exceptions in the default Perl way. Now this is it for this video. We looked at how we can do much better exception handling using try-tiny, SmartCatch, and exception class modules instead of the out-of-the-box die and eval functions. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you at the next one.